There are tales of Cinderella told all over the world. There are at least 343 versions. Every single culture seems to have some sort of a version of a Cinderella story. What are some elements that make a story a Cinderella story? What are some?
A ball.
A ball, where the prince is going to pick a wife, right? What else?
A prince.
A prince. And prince is usually the prize at the end, that marry the prince and become rich, yes.
Well, maybe a girl who's not treated fair.
A girl who's not treated fairly at home, yes. What else?
A lost slipper.
A lost slipper, yes. What else?
Something magical happens to Cinderella or whatever.
Something magical happens, yes. It's not always a fairy godmother, but something happens, yes. What else?
Bad sisters.
Bad sisters, yes. What else? Yeah.
A stepmother that doesn't treat her very well.
A stepmother that doesn't treat her very well, yes.
Cinderella.
Cinderella. Now, what does Cinderella mean?
I forgot
Why does she get the name Cinderella?
She sits by the fireplace in the cinders.
She sits by the fireplace in the cinders. All right, now I have 3 different versions of stories that have some of these elements. And the first story comes from Italy. And in Italy, her name is Cenerentola. Long ago, in Napoli, there was a rich prince. He had one daughter named Zezola, and her mother died. And the prince and Zezola were very, very sad. The prince hired a governess to take care of Zezola and to teach her how to read, how to paint, how to make lace, how to knit. And every day as the governess sat by Zezola, she would comb her hair. And the little girl would say, "Oh, I wish you were my mother." And the governess said, "If you were my daughter, I would love you more than life itself." "Oh," she said, the little girl, "how could you become my mother?" "I will tell you," said the governess. "When your father is caressing you, ask him to marry me." And Zezola said, "All right." After the period of mourning was over, Zezola began to say to her father, the prince, "Oh, I wish you would marry my governess and make her your princess." At first the father just laughed, but Zezola kept saying it again and again, and at last the prince decided that he would. So there was a fine wedding, and the prince married the governess. And while all of the people were dancing, Zezola walked out on the balcony overlooking the sea, and as she stood there, a dove flew and alighted on the balustrade and said, "I come from the dove of the fairies of Sardinia, and she commends herself to you. And if you ever need anything, just ask her." And the dove flew away. Well, Zezola's new mother was so kind and good and sweet to her. Oh, she fussed over her and hugged her and kissed her for, 5 or 6 days. And then all of a sudden, she brought forward 6 daughters of her own. No one knew that she was a widow with 6 daughters. And she began talking about them to her husband, the prince. And she knew how to present them in such a favorable light that soon he began to like her daughters better than his own daughter, Zezola. And Zezola was sent to the kitchen, where she sat among the cinders and was known as Cenerentola, which in another language, and since this is an Italian story, would be Italian, means Cinderella. After a while, the prince was going on a trip to the island of Sardinia, and he said to his 6 new daughters, "What can I get each of you?" And one said, "Dresses," and another said, "Jewelry," and another said, "Rouge," and so on and so on, and each one had an elaborate gift to request. And then he said to his own daughter, almost in a mocking way, "And what can I get you?" And Cenerentola said, "Ask the dove of the fairies of Sardinia to give me something. And if you forget to ask her, may your ship be frozen in the harbor, neither able to move forward or backward." Well, the prince sailed off to Sardinia, and he gathered all of the gifts for his wife's daughters, but he forgot what Cenerentola had asked him. And then he went to sail back home. But when he went to sail back home, the ship would not move. The captain did everything he could think of. He hoisted up sails. He took down sails. He moved the rudder. But the ship would not go forward. At last, the captain was so exhausted, he fell asleep on the deck. And he had a dream. And in his dream, there appeared a beautiful fairy. And she said the reason that the ship won't move is because the prince forgot the present for his very own daughter. And the captain woke up and told the prince what the fairy had said. And the prince was filled with remorse. He went to the grotto of the fairies, and there a beautiful fairy appeared to him. And she said, "I have presents for your daughter. I have a little tiny date tree. I have a golden bucket. I have a golden hoe. And I have a little silk handkerchief for your daughter to wipe the leaves of the date tree." Well, now the ship sailed back home to Napoli very quickly, and the prince distributed the gifts. Cenerentola was delighted with her little tiny nut tree. She planted it in the ground, and she took the little golden hoe, and she hoed the ground, and she filled the little golden bucket with water, and she watered the tree. And every day, she carefully wiped the leaves with a silken napkin. And in a few days, the little date tree had grown till it was about the same size as Cenerentola. As she stood there looking at the tree, suddenly out stepped a fairy. And the fairy said, "I will grant you any wish. What would you wish?" Cenerentola said, "You know what I would like? I would like to be able to leave the house without my sisters knowing about it." And the fairy said, "This is what you do. I can give you new clothes to wear. When you want to do that, you come to the tree and you say, 'Little tree, my golden tree, with the golden bucket I watered thee, with the golden hoe I hoed thee, and with the silken handkerchief I wiped thy leaves. Strip thee and clothe me speedily.' And when you want to give the clothes back, you say, 'Strip me and clothe thee.'" And Cenerentola smiled. And the next day, they heard of a great ball that the king was giving to choose a wife. And oh, those 6 stepsisters of Cenerentola, remember she had 6 of them, they were telling them about how they were going to get dressed for the ball. And Cenerentola just smiled secretly. And on the night of the ball, the sisters went off, and Cenerentola went to the tree, and she recited the little rhyme, and she was immediately clothed in a beautiful dress, given a horse to ride, and 12 pages to follow after. And when she appeared at the palace, the king had eyes for no one but her. And when the ball was over, and she was going to go home, the king grabbed one of his servants and said, "Follow her. Don't let her get away." Cenerentola was prepared for that. She had a bag of gold coins. And when she saw the servant following her, she scattered the gold on the ground, and the servant stopped to pick it up. And Cenerentola got home, gave back the dress, and no one was the wiser. Now, the next day, there was another ball, and as soon as the 6 sisters went off, Cenerentola went to the tree. And this time, many maids appeared, and they all combed her hair and put on makeup and gave her a beautiful dress, and she looked lovely as before. She hopped on her horse, and off she rode. And the king had said to his servant, "Don't you let her escape again." But as soon as the ball was over, Cenerentola had a handful of pearls, which she scattered on the ground. And of course, the servant stopped to pick up the pearls, and once again she got home safely. Well, on the night of the 3rd ball, she was given the most gorgeous dress of all, and a gold carriage, and horses, and a coachman. And that night the king said to his servant, "If you let her escape again, you will get the beating of your life." So the servant was ready. At the end of the ball, Cenerentola waved goodbye to the king, hopped into the carriage, and off it went with the servant running along as fast as ever he could. And she knocked on the carriage and said to the coachman, "Drive faster!" And he did. Clop, 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 clop. And the servant ran faster and faster, and she was going so fast in the carriage that one of her shoes flew out the window. And the servant took the shoe back to the king. And the king looked and said, "What a beautiful shoe to have imprisoned her lovely foot." On the next day, he gave one of those big parties for every girl in the whole countryside to come and try on the shoe. And he had pasta, remember this is in Italy, and pastries. But the shoe didn't fit anybody. And the king said, "Are you sure we have everybody here?" And those 6 stepsisters said, "Well, we do have a little sister at home, but she just likes to sit in the kitchen. She must come to tomorrow's party." And Cenerentola did. She walked right in, and she sat down. And as soon as it was time to try on the shoe, it just seemed as if the shoe flew right on her foot. And the king put a gold crown on her head, and everyone cried, "Long live the queen." And that's the Italian version called Cenerentola. What did you like about that one? Was there?
I like the part about the date tree.
The date tree, yeah.
I like how she brought like stuff to put on the ground for the servant.
She was in charge, wasn't she? It wasn't like the stepmother who sometimes throws peas in the ashes and says you can't go to unless you pick. She was in charge. What did you like?
I like I just forgot that
Yeah. What were you going to say?
I like the part when the ship freezes in the middle of the water.
Yeah, it was her idea too. Yeah. What did you like?
I like the part when like the servant keeps on chasing her.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, but I like the part where the dove said, "I'll give you anything you want."
Yes, yes. What were you?
I like the part when the prince asked when he had the pasta stuff.
Yeah.
And he none of the shoes didn't fit any girl except one, and it flew right over.
And I just flew it on her foot. Yeah.
I like the part when the stepmother came and she was like brushing the girl's hair.
Yeah, you didn't really know that was going to turn into the stepmother, did you? Yeah.
When the servant was chasing the horse.
Yeah, yeah. He had to do it. He didn't want to get beat. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we'll have another version.
If you're worried about the future, plant a tree today.
They clean the air we breathe, create beauty,
They cool our cities,
shade us in the summer,
Conserve energy.
help fight pollution.
and protect us from the cold winter winds.
Birds will come here when it gets bigger. Children will play under its branches.
City trees add the soft touch of nature to our busy lives.
It'll give shade, keep things cool. And all the time it's growing, it'll clear the air we breathe.
Make life livable for all.
All this from one little pine tree.
That's the miracle of trees.
Start a tradition and plant a tree for each of your children.
and make a commitment to their care.
Hey, why don't you plant a tree too? Please. Trees for America.
Plant a tree, trees for America. Plant a tree today for all the world to share.
One of the things about Cinderella is that she's sitting in the ashes, and that sort of symbolizes how she's mourning for her dead mother, because in a lot of cultures, people, when they are mourning for someone who has died, cover themselves with ashes. And this is a story that emphasizes the mourning for the dead, but not necessarily with the main character. Long ago, in a castle by the sea, there lived a rich lord. His wife had died. All of his children had died. He was only left with one granddaughter, and she was the child of his favorite daughter. But when the girl had been born, her mother had died, and the baby was brought to the old man, and he said, "Take her away. I don't care if she lives or not. I never will look upon her face again because she caused the death of my favorite child." And so this old man sat in his stone castle, and his hair grew and bound him to the window. And his tears flowed, and they flowed in rivulets out the window and into the sea. Now this poor little granddaughter didn't have anybody to take care of her but a nurse, and everyone else in the castle was so mean to her. They called her Tattercoats because she just wore raggedy clothes, and she stayed in the kitchen all the time. She had one friend besides her old nurse, and that was a crippled gooseherd. She would go outside, and there he'd be with his flock of geese, and he smiled at her, and he took up his little flute, and he played such a merry tune that she quite forgot her troubles. And she would dance around with one of the geese as a partner. At last, there was an invitation that came to the Lord that the king was giving a ball for his son so that he could pick a wife from amongst the local girls. And since the invitation was a sort of command, the Lord had to go. He had his servants come, and with scissors they cut his long hair so he could stand up. And they cut his hair quite short and dressed him in fine clothes. He quite forgot that he did have a little granddaughter that he could take to the party. The old nurse went and begged that he take Tattercoats with him, but he said, "No, I never wish to look upon her face again." And he dressed in his fine clothes, and off he went. And when the nurse went back to the kitchen, she found that the cook had already turned Tattercoats away and told her never to return. When Tattercoats went into the garden, there was her friend the gooseherd. And he said, "You want to go to see the ball? Come on, let's go see the fine doings in town." "Oh, no, I couldn't," said Tattercoats, but he lifted his flute to his lips and played such a happy tune that soon they were skipping through the woods on their way to the town to see the fine ball. And as they were going through the woods, suddenly, clip-clop, clip-clop, there was a horse approaching, and riding on the horse's back was a beautifully dressed young man. And the young man said, "Tell me, is this the way to the palace?" "It certainly is," said Tattercoats. And the young man hopped down from his horse, and he said, "Could I walk with you a while? You look as if you would be merry companions." And they started to walk through the forest together. And the gooseherd lifted his flute to his lips and played a tune, but it was not a dance tune. And as the young man looked at Tattercoats in her raggy dresses, he suddenly realized how very beautiful she was. And the more the song played, the more he fell in love with her. And he said, you are the one. I want you to come to the ball, and I will dance with you before all the fine lords and ladies, just dressed as you are. I will see you tonight." And he hopped back on his horse, and off he rode, and Tattercoat said, "Oh, I couldn't do that." And the gooseherd said, "Oh, yes, you could." And that night, at the ball, suddenly at midnight, the doors flew open, and in came the strangest group. A girl in raggy clothes, a lame gooseherd, and a flock of geese. And they stood there at the doorway. And all of the fine lords and ladies, the king and the queen, and the old lord stared. But then the prince stood up from the throne and walked down and took Tattercoats by the hand and kissed her 3 times before the assembled throng. And he said, "This is the girl that I choose to be my wife." And the gooseherd lifted his flute to his lips and played a tune. And suddenly, Tattercoats was dressed in a golden dress with a golden crown and a golden hair, and those geese turned into 12 page boys that lifted up the long train of her dress. And the king himself came down and accepted Tattercoats as the wife of his son. And as for the gooseherd, he was never seen again. And as for the old lord, since he had sworn never to look upon his granddaughter's face for the rest of his life, he had to go back home to the castle by the sea, where he sat in the stone room and his hair grew and bound him to the window, and his tears flowed down in rivulets and joined the sea. What did you like about that version?
About the gooseherd and how he played his flute.
Yes?
I like the part when he was sad and so his hair grew long and he cried.
Yeah, that's kind of unusual.
He said to the girl, "I never want to see you."
Mm-hmm. Yeah?
All of his daughters died and his wife died.
Yeah, that was pretty sad, wasn't it?
He never wanted to see her again, but she was he didn't really like her, and he was treating her bad, and then she became the princess.
Right, yeah.
I like the part when her dress turned into a golden dress.
Mm-hmm.
With the crowns on her.
Yeah.
I like the part when the doors flew open and she came in with it.
I liked the part when the prince picked her out. He liked her when she was in raggedy clothes. It wasn't the golden dress that made him like her. It was herself. He recognized her for what she truly was. And now we'll take a little break. These are 3 versions of Cinderella Stories. This is Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters by John Steptoe. John Steptoe was a wonderful African-American writer and illustrator. And a little secret about this book, that he used his one daughter as the model for both of the sisters. And then the sad part is that he died at a very young age, right after this book was published. This is The Rough-Faced Girl, which is an Algonquin version from Native American people by Rafe Martin. And I have a particular interest in the Korean Cinderella. The very day that I read this story for the first time to 2nd graders at Johnson was the day that the Crown Prince of Japan was marrying a girl who was not of the aristocracy. She was sort of the common people. And as a matter of fact, she'd gone to school at Belmont Hill, right here in Massachusetts. So it was sort of like a real-life Cinderella story of a girl who married
the prince.